I know.
She was ichthyologist. I forgot to add that.
Right, exactly.
That's a good story. Well,
Okay, we're at 6:02.
I guess I'll take off my glasses. Welcome, everyone. It's really lovely to see so many people here on a lovely summer evening. Scott Farm is so beautiful. I was telling Kelly, we have some apple trees and a peach tree on our land that we got here. So my name is William Autoglass, and I teach at Marlboro College, and I know a number of you, not all of you. And this evening's discussion is part of something called the Brattleboro Words Trail. The Brattleboro Words Project is the larger project. And what it is a project funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. They gave us a matching grant. And there are a number of organizations involved: Marlboro College, Write Action, a local group of writers, the Literary Festival, the Historical Society, and Brooks Memorial Library. And together we are doing several years of activities which will culminate in two things. One, a book on local publishing, and two, a audio mapping of a number of sites beginning in Brattleboro and spreading out on both sides of the Connecticut River that will be available through audio tours that you can do while biking, walking, or driving. And it will give us a richer, more complex understanding of our history through the history of words, letters, diaries, books, famous authors, Rudyard Kipling, but also how, say, Native people used writing to defend their homelands, and Native people have been writing in this area for a long time. And the first extant poem by an African-American poet was by an author who lived right in Guilford. So we're looking at a whole bunch of different sites and how writing gives us access to them. And writing is understood broadly from petroglyphs to, say, advertisements for the circus coming through. And there are a number of school classes that are involved, schools on both sides of the river, and community groups. So individuals who are interested in a particular site or a particular figure. You may have a fabulous interest in Clarina Nichols, the 19th century feminist who lived here in Brattleboro. And you may want to do some work on her. And if you do, there is a sign-up sheet in the back, and you can sign up there. And Lissa Weinman is our project director. You can also talk to her, or a number of other people in this room are involved in this project. So Sandy Roos and Mary Ide and Jerry Carbone. There are a number of us here you can speak with. And we are also looking for donations because the NEH grant is a matching grant, and so we're raising $150,000. So we would welcome donations. Before I get to this evening, is there anything I should add, Lisa? Or anybody else?
We have our website, brattleborowords.org, and there's a lot more information, including a list of the 40 or so sites that we have currently identified as sites that are important in the history of words that we are building podcasts around.
So for many of us, we feel it's a very exciting project for a number of reasons, to bring communities together, to have a more complex understanding of our own history and a richer sense of our own history. Which leads us to one aspect of this project, which is each month we are having a roundtable discussion that is being led by people involved with the project. This evening, it is actually a round table. And at this round table, we have Kelly Carlin, who is the Managing Director for Landmark Trust USA. And every time I am here, I am astounded at how beautiful and well kept this place is. And it must take an enormous amount of work and an enormous amount of management. So I'm so grateful for the work that you do. And Chuck Fish, who is a retired professor of English and a student and scholar of Kipling, who resides here in Dummerston. And Tom Ragle, who is the former president of Marlboro College, where he was president when you were 28.
Oh, no,
30?
yeah.
30 for several decades, and is also a student of Kipling and a poet. The last time I heard Tom Ragle speak on poetry was in a tuxedo, but that's a story for another time. So what's going to happen is Kelly's going to speak for a short time about where we are in Landmark Trust, and then Chuck and Tom are both going to speak for about 10 minutes each, giving us a context of Kipling in Vermont, and then we'll move into a broader discussion with our panelists. So thank you so much for coming, and Kelly.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Scott Farm. Very happy you could join us here this evening. My name is Kelly. I'm the operations manager for the Landmark Trust USA. The Landmark Trust is a nonprofit whose mission is historic preservation. We rescue historically significant houses that are threatened. We restore them using what we call conservative repair, and then rent them out for vacation purposes, hoping that that one-on-one experience with history will make our guests want to then support it. We own and manage Rudyard Kipling's Vermont home, Naulakha, built in 1892. We purchased it in 1992. When we purchased it, it had been abandoned for 50 years. The entire south foundation of the house had collapsed, and there was a family of raccoons living in the house. But all of the furniture was still there. The pictures were on the walls. It's like someone left and closed the door and left it a time capsule for someone new to discover. Worldwide, Landmark Trust owns over 200 properties in England, Scotland, Italy, Wales, France, and the US, where we now have 5 properties. We also own the Scott Farm, which has a recorded history back to George Washington's first term as president. All 23 buildings on the farm are listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And we are coming into season. This year we will grow 125 varieties of heirloom apples. So we hope you'll come back in a couple of months and enjoy some of the fruits of our labor with us.
Thank you. Chuck.
I spent too many years in the classroom to talk sitting down, so I don't want to loom over you, but I will project better if I'm standing up. Before we turn to Kipling, I want to turn to me. A few years ago, Wayne Carhart, now deceased, and I wrote a photo book called On the Job, the Brattleboro Public Works Department. And I'm fond of saying that it sold like cold cakes. We have many, many copies left. The price has been reduced to $0. And on the table at the entrance or exit, if you would like a copy, help yourself. If you want 2 copies, help yourself, or as many as you would like. It's a very fine book, and it's only the obstinacy of the reading public that it didn't sell better. Well, anyway, it's a pleasure to be here. I spoke at the Kipling Symposium when the Kipling Society met here in October 2013, and so my remarks tonight are in part drawn from that occasion. That was a fine occasion. The Kipling Society is based in London, but they came for their annual meeting in 2013 to Marlboro College because of the fine work that Tom and others have done collecting Kipling material, and here to the Scott Farm for obvious reasons.
First time outside of England.
The first time outside of England, Tom tells me. There are a couple of books, you can look at them later if you want, that are particularly interesting if you are interested in Kipling in America and Vermont. One's called Kipling's America, and the other is called Rudyard Kipling in Vermont, which is most directly relevant. What I propose to do is introduce briefly 4 topics that I think are important to our understanding of Kipling in Vermont and to some extent Kipling more generally. And the 4 topics are, first, why did Kipling come to Vermont in the first place? And then why did he leave? And of course, he left because of Beatty Balestier, to put it very bluntly. And I'll talk a little more about him. And then second, Kipling's varying opinion of Vermonters, contrasting opinions in some cases, and Americans generally. He had some very sharp opinions, many of them not favorable, but they're well worth thinking about because it's just possible there's a grain of truth in them, although we hate to admit it. And third, one of the reasons Kipling had trouble, I think, understanding America is because he had a conception, not original with him, of what a sound, healthy community, political community is, what constitutes it. Very different from the American view. We'll talk about that. And then finally, the question of Kipling's alleged racism, which is a hot topic in some quarters, and we'll talk a bit about that. So let me just quickly review some of the highlights in those four topics. But for the most part, to get into the details, and I have a number of relevant quotations and citations, that would probably best come up in discussion. He married Caroline Carey Balestier in England in 1892. Her family had a summer home in Brattleboro. Beechwood, that lovely house just down the road, was her grandmother's house. They set out, he was, by the way, although only 27, I believe, already worldwide famous. His early stories and poems had sold and were admired around the world. So they went on a round-the-world, he was a great traveler, so they left on a round-the-world wedding trip. They came through Brattleboro, bought 10 acres of land from her brother, Beatty Balestier, the villain of the piece, many people would say, and went on, traveled across the country, got to Japan. His London bank failed, and he was absolutely broke. So they came back to the United States, they came back to Brattleboro, and they decided to stay for a while. And that was the beginning of their occupation of this place. Now, the Beatty's role in the building of Naulakha was something like a clerk of the works or general manager. And one of the difficulties that led to the tension between him and his sister and Rudyard was that he was a very sloppy financial man. His sister thought that he was worse than sloppy, that he might have been sly. But in any case, tensions built over the months and the years. Some people think that if it hadn't been for Carey, Rudyard might eventually got along okay with Beatty. Rudyard in some ways was more of an American than his wife. Carey, just to give you a quick example, Carey had brought in a coachman from England or Scotland, and she would ride to Brattleboro in a coach, horses and coach, with a coachman standing behind her in a top hat and doeskin breeches. And you can imagine what the Brattleboro people thought when they saw this phenomenal sight coming down the road.
Well, they say she had the tiger skin thrown over her shoulder.
Oh, I forgot. Yes. I didn't know the tiger skin. Yes. Yeah, maybe. So Beatty was I'll read you a very brief description by Dummerston author Frederick Vandewater, who befriended Beatty and wormed out the Kipling story from him and then wrote a book afterwards. Beatty's widow allegedly said that Vandewater had promised never to write it up or publish it, but he did. Anyway, according to Vandewater, this is Beatty. He was brilliant, witty, generous, charming, brave, proud, willful, violent, profane, a splash of scarlet against Vermont's greens, grays, and browns, publicly deplored and privately envied, possessor of that priceless gift of the gods, charm, magnetism, that conceals sins which charity could not begin to clothe.
Wow.
From my dooryard, I can see the house that he lived in for a number of years and where he died. And my neighbor across the road, who died at 102, remembers Beatty on his porch ringing his porch bell, which is now in the Dummerston Historical Society, and depending how drunk he was, yelling out to people going by, "Come up, goddammit, have a drink." In discussion, if you wish, I'll tell you another story that's a little on the dusty side, but I'll leave that. The climax was that Beatty and Rudyard had a near collision on the road. Rudyard on his bicycle, Beatty charging along as he always did with horse and carriage. And Rudyard, according to Beatty, had been gossiping about him, about his problems and his drinking and his behavior and so forth. And so Beatty supposedly said to him, I want you to understand, if you don't retract the goddamn lies you've told about me, I'll knock the goddamn soul out of you, and I'll blow out your goddamn brains. Well, Kipling didn't take that well, but he made a grave mistake. Instead of either standing up for himself, he says, if you try to do that to me, I'll do that for you, I'm a man too, or ignore it, but instead he took him to court, brought legal charges against him. It led to a hearing, a legal hearing. Reporters came from 40 newspapers to attend that hearing. It was a great circus. Beatty loved it. He was the star of the show, even though he was the man being charged. Kipling was humiliated. The hearing ended, and the judge just said, we'll meet again in so many weeks.
September.
The thought of that, pardon?
September.
In September. The thought of that was more than Kipling and his wife could stand. They packed up and they left, and they never came back. We can get into their attempt to come back at one point, but they never got here. Well, a little more quickly now. His opinion of Vermonters. Things he wrote about Vermont when he was here in Brattleboro included the following. He talked about the terrifying intimacy of small-town life, referring to Brattleboro, and the gossip and the rumors, and women belonging to literary societies and therefore thinking that they had something to do when in fact what they were doing amounted to nothing at all. He was very scornful. This wasn't public, but these were in letters. He said that was in-town life. The countryside, which as you probably know was going through a really hard time with a lot of people leaving the farms and the abandonment of farm life in Vermont. He said it would be hard to exaggerate the loneliness and sterility of life on the farms. He said that these people were leaving and their place was being taken by the wreckage of Eastern Europe or the wealthy city folk who bought pleasure farms. And then a very interesting remark. He's a good writer. What might have become characters, that is, defined faculties, you might say, powers and attributes perverted themselves in that desolation as cankered trees throw out branches akimbo. So instead of a healthy tree, you've got this tree with the bark peeling off and the limbs going out like that. And also strange faiths and cruelties, born of solitude to the edge of insanity. And all of this flourished like lichen on bark. And he also went on at great length about the drinking. Everybody was a drunkard, according to him. Vermont was a dry state, but in discussion I can tell you some amusing stories about what that actually meant. He also thought that behind the feverish activity of business people in Brattleboro and America generally, there was immense boredom because ultimately materialism, he thought, was boring. All right, third, the ideal character of a political community. Mary Cabot said that he could never really understand the Americans. He was always a foreigner. And Vandewater said something the same thing. Well, here's some of his remarks. He says, Americans talk a lot about freedom. Kipling said, there's no force at the back of the incessant posing to be free. No force behind that. Only common people doing common things in the cheapest and most effective way for immediate results. Regarding American reverence for the people, in quotes. Remember the Gettysburg Address now when I read it. There's nothing to the people. A jot more to be reverenced than in kings and the divine right of the same. And they are only men anyway, not gods. He thought that the belief in the divine right of kings was bunkum, but so was the reverence for us, for the people. Now, what would transform these people into something worthy of admiration? one of the things is obedience. Obedience is a persistent theme topic in Kipling. And for example, following some practical advice to Mowgli in the Jungle Books, there are these famous remarks. Now these are the laws of the jungle, and many and mighty are they. But the head and the hoof of the law, and the haunch and the hump is obey, obey. Now, but obey what? I mean, you obey tyrants? Do you obey fools? I mean, what is it to obey? His idea is to obey a sound political community that recognizes the importance of the group, of the community, rather than the individual, although the individual is a necessary part. And so he says in the Jungle Books, as the creeper that girdles the tree trunk, the law runneth forward and back, for the strength of the pack is the wolf, and the strength of the wolf is the pack. And in the discussion, remind me, and I will mention a piece called Her Majesty's Servants, which also makes this argument. It's very different, I think, from the most common understanding we have of what political life is. Finally, Kipling's so-called racism. Was he a racist? Well, the short answer is no, but it won't do. And as Tom reminded me as we were walking in, it would be better to accuse him of a caste-conscious man or a class-conscious man than a racist in the strict sense of believing that people are inherently inferior because of their race. He wasn't a systematic thinker, so you can find this, that, and the other in him scattered about, and they won't always sound consistent. But remember Gunga Din? You're a better man than the water bearer. You're a better man than I am, Gunga Din. And the Ballad of East and West. There is neither breed nor birth. There is neither breed nor birth. Something or something. I've lost it. When two strong men come face to face, so they come from the ends of the earth. Character overrides racial or differences. Did he believe in the inherent inferiority of other races? I think not, but he did believe in levels of civilization. And he thought that it was the duty of the Western powers to, through their colonies, to raise up or elevate the people they had captured, they had overtaken. And again, there's more about that I can refer to if you're more material to sort of illustrate what I've said. And that's enough.
Forgive me if I sit. It's difficult for me now to stand without a cane for any time. I want to talk about two things. Briefly, about the origin of the Kipling Collection at Marlboro College, which is available to you. And the other is his literary standing at the time he was in Vermont and today. Back about 1979 or 80, we received a letter at the college from Otis Guernsey, Jr., to say that he had inherited from his father an entire set of Kipling's works bound in leather. And, it's something like 34 volumes. And he thought that the collection should remain in Vermont, and he was inviting 4 institutions to bid on it. He was offering it for $11,000. Well, we didn't have $11,000. The Wyndham Foundation was one of the 4, UVM was one of the 4, and Middlebury College is one of the 4, along with Marlboro. So I wrote the Wyndham Foundation, and I said I thought this collection should remain in Windham County. And they very gracefully obliged by giving us the money to buy it. They didn't have a library to care for it. That was the initial foundation of the collection. I might say that I then forced myself to read all 34 volumes, most of which I have forgotten long ago. More about that later. However, Howard Rice, Jr. had written the first book about Kipling in America and in New England in 1936. He had gone on to a career in libraries, the Rare Books Library at Princeton. He had retired back to Brattleboro, and he was on the visitors to the Howard and Amy Rice Library. I asked him to drive up with me to Guernsey, up somewhere around Barnard, and evaluate the collection. He did. He said it is worth $11,000, but he said, Tom, you have to recognize that a large number of people from that generation collected Kipling, so it is far from unique, even in its other bindings. More important, with that as a basis, Howard was working on the Molly Cabot memoir. Now, Molly Cabot, who wrote the Annals of Brattleboro, was a good friend of the Kiplings, always welcome in their house, and she entertained them in hers. And eventually, she bought Naulakha for her sister and her husband in 1911. And that's how the Holbrooks got it. She wrote for her sister a memoir which, back in 1980, was unpublished and largely unknown. Howard knew about it. I tried to find it in the basement of the Holbrook home and couldn't. It did turn up. It now, incidentally, belongs to the Landmark Trust, who have entrusted it to the Marlboro Library to take care of it because we have library facilities, but it belongs to the trust. It is a very important document. One day, Howard came to me and he said, Tom, I have edited the Molly Cabot memoir. I've also written a book about Kipling in America, but there's no interest in it among publishers. If I die, will you see if you can get the memoir published? Well, he knew something I didn't, because a few months later he did die. And I was able to get it published in English Literature in Transition, 1880 and 1920. And it is available in, well, the Marlboro College Library and elsewhere. It's a fascinating series of journal entries. She wanted her sister to know a little bit about what Kipling was like. And so she took from her journal and put them down in paper, and I'll read just a couple of paragraphs. As I was going to the hotel, Carrie Kipling arrived to say that I must come to her dinner in a stuffed gown, as there would be dancing in the barn later. Blanche Carpenter, Elliot Ballastier, Josephine Ballastier, and Mrs. Walcott Ballastier were at dinner. Kipling took me out, and I sat at his right, while his genius flashed and glowed. At 8 o'clock, we went to the barn, which was lighted with kerosene lamps. The refreshments, cider and sandwiches, were served from a pile of lumber. Kipling had fastened pieces of paper to the wall with inscriptions like these. Here are the marble pillars. This is the Gilded Dawn. They had a fiddler from Slab Hollow. The Gladdens, with two men friends from Boston, were there, and the Beatties, as the Kiplings call Mr. and Mrs. Beatty, Ethel Dalton and Bach Ward. There were fortunes for the dance. Kipling and I led. My driver brought me home flying just before midnight. On these occasions, as at all times, Kipling talked, as he wrote, with incomparable freshness and vigor, improvising for our amusement a story or play in which his hearers figured as dramatis personae, or verses on some theme touching the emotions of the moment. Stimulated by a humorous suggestion from one of his playmates, he once composed with marvelous rapidity 75 verses in succession, until we were quite exhausted by the strain of catching the words and implored him to refrain from giving us more. He kept on until we covered our ears, as if he could not control the impetus of the creative impulse his boyish spirits had set in motion, and so forth. It's a very intimate description of their life together. He loved children. Like Teddy Roosevelt, he'd get down on his hands and knees and play with them. And with his friends, he was very warm and open. He detested journalists because they made such a fuss over him and didn't give him the privacy he needed. Well, gradually over the years, in addition to the Molly Cabot Memoir, which is at the Marlboro Library now, a lockbox was found in the old Vermont National Bank. It hadn't been opened since 1896 when the Kiplings left. And they forgot about it. The estate had forgotten about it. The bank didn't want it. They got in touch with us back in 1980, and we showed an interest, and I think we finally got it in the early 1990s, with the provision that if any legal Kipling heir should appear, and I don't believe there are any, the family has died out, why, of course, we would pass it over if it was legally necessary. It doesn't contain a lot of really valuable stuff, but it has some interesting stuff. It has a letter to Wolcott Balestier talking about the name of the book. It has terms of agreement between William Heinemann and Rudyard Kipling and Anna S. Balestier, executor, concerning book publication of Naulakha in January 1892. Another agreement with a publisher. A part of the manuscript of Naulakha, which is important to scholars because it's not entirely clear. We think we know pretty well, but it's not absolutely clear which Wolcott Balestier wrote and which Kipling wrote.
People may not know that they collaborated on the book.
They collaborated on the book, yes. They wrote the book together. And a one-page letter from Wolcott and things of this sort. A will dated 25th of January, 1892. Some poems in manuscript, and so on. When Howard Crosby died, he willed all his Kipling material to the college, and that's some of the most important stuff that we have. The results of his research in writing his book back in 1936, and then his later book, which never was published, and the manuscript of that book. Now, for his standing as a writer. The 1890s was a period of interregnum in English literature. The three great Victorian poets, for instance, Arnold died in 1888, Browning in 1889, and Tennyson in 1892, just at the time when Kipling was arriving from India around 1890. There was a gap. The moderns didn't come along for another decade or more. Yeats and Eliot and Pound and people like this. Here was somebody new writing about new subject matter, India, and the English public gobbled it up. He was a very prolific writer. As I say, his collected works, standard collected works, Scribner's, came to something like 34 volumes. And just his poems, I just brought this along as an illustration. This is one of 3 volumes, 2,300 pages of poetry, edited by Professor Pinney of the Claremont Colleges. For a long time, he was the darling of the English public. Then, suddenly, about 1913, I'm going to quote from Robert Frost, he was eclipsed by Yeats. And there's a fascinating paragraph in a letter from Robert Frost to Sidney Cox on the 2nd of May, 1913. I think I understand Yeats to say the other night that Tagore, the Indian poet, whose poetry is the latest big thing here, has been visiting your college at Urbana, Illinois. I meant to ask Yeats more about it. I wonder if you met Tagore. Very likely I shall run across him before he goes back to Bengal. I was to have met him at Ernest Rhys Sunday, but decided in the end to take some other day for my call when I could have Rhys more to myself. Tagore comes to Yeats here as the greatest English poet. How slowly but surely Yeats has eclipsed Kipling. I have seen it all happen with my own eyes. You would expect to see Tagore seeking Kipling for his Indian sympathies and interests, but no. He is drawn to Maeterlinck on the continent and to Yeats on these islands. There's great irony in this, because if you were to ask me, and I think this judgment is shared by a number, I'm not a Kipling scholar, by the way, I'm not a Kipling expert. he's outside of my particular field. But his greatest work is Kim, which people think of as a child's book. It is not. It is a child's book, but it is much more. And if you read it symbolically, with the colors of red and green and yellow, and you make the distinction between the mountains from which comes the llama and the plains where Kim comes from and so forth, and you take a look at the goals of each of them, the llama and of Kim, it's a highly symbolic book, and it goes deep. Enamal Karim, the Indian-born professor at a university in the West, says that in Kim, Kipling, more than any other English writer, caught the essence of India in the distinction between the mountains and the plains. Now, the other great work, in my opinion, that Kipling wrote, other than a few great poems like Danny Deever, are found in this 2-volume set of Penguin Modern Classics, his late short stories. Ironically, at the time his reputation was in eclipse in England, he was doing his best work. I think there's very little question that he is among the greatest of English short story writers. I recommend these 2 volumes strongly. One of them, his method of writing, by the way, was to cross out everything until only the essence was left. And there's a famous short story in there, I think it's Mrs. Bathurst, which is crossed out a little too much. And the scholars have been arguing ever since what he was saying, what the story is about. It's a magnificent story, but nobody quite knows really what it's all about. But I recommend this to you. That's enough, I think. We'll talk further.
So the idea was that we would move into a discussion, and Kelly, Chuck, and Tom would also be welcome to say any. I personally find it fascinating listening to your talking, but there's also a lot of knowledge here in the group, and so if you have questions, you can pose them as questions to the panelists, or if you have things that you want to add, feel free. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, on the question of Kipling's racism, in Recessional, there's the famous line, "Lesser breeds without the law." And I've heard that he actually had the Germans in mind when he wrote that. Is there any evidence for that, or is it a myth?
Did he, when he said lesser breeds without the law, he meant the German? I don't think so. I think he meant the non-Western peoples.
The less civilized people.
The less, in his opinion, less civilized people.
That's what was important.
I'm pretty
to him.
sure. The Recessional is a very interesting poem. A friend of mine who doesn't know Kipling well at all, as you'll see, read Recessional and says Kipling was a pacifist. I said, David, you've got to go beyond Recessional. But it's a very interesting poem because in it, Kipling worries about, he talks about our navies and armies fading away, that nothing is permanent, and that if we don't obey the law, and he meant partly by that Christianity, although he wasn't a deeply religious man in the strict sectarian sense, without that, without the law, some notion of decency, then military might is a bad thing. So would you agree with that?
I would. I think that the overtone of the law, too, is the law of the jungle.
But that's
the
obey.
Natural law.
But that's obey.
Yeah, you have to obey it.
I mean, it's not tooth and claw. That's
No,
not
it's
the law
not
of the jungle.
it's not
The law of the
tooth and claw.
jungle is obedience.
Yeah, back there.
What was Kipling's reaction to American capitalism?
American capitalism?
Capitalism?
I think it was pretty much taken for granted.
Yeah, he got along well with American wealthy people and Theodore Roosevelt and the Washington establishment and so on. So he wasn't at odds with it, but he did think that America was. He admired the vigor in some of his early writings from his travels out west. He admired the vigor which would have shown up in capitalism and industrialism, But he did think that it was, in some sense, lawless, in the sense we're talking about, that it didn't have call it a moral or spiritual foundation. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So he was skeptical, but you had to admire it because this was a powerful force and it was changing the world. And he could see what was happening. America was the coming thing. And he worried that it would be the coming thing without being a decently, lawful and orderly sort of thing. He has some, later I've got some really harsh remarks about us. Yeah.
Given the fact that he is not a popular read in college, and has there been any resurgence of interest in Kipling given all the Disney films? There's one I see that's coming out soon about Malcolm. But Jungle Book and Kim have all been Disney-ified.
I found that some people don't even know that Kipling wrote the Jungle Books. That, when they stay in the houses, will have the Jungle Book there, and then they'll realize when they see who the author is, that is actually who it was. They just think it's Disney. Yes, but I don't know.
Tom would know better than I.
Well, I think there's an undercurrent of interest in Kipling that has never died. The Kipling Society in Britain, I was once the American representative because I kept the money in dollars. I kept their account over here. That has been very strong and remains strong, but it's a certain core of people that keep on. He's not studied in college much now. He is not, in fact, I think he's overly overlooked because of a lot of good stuff. He doesn't deal profoundly with philosophical issues. One of the things, for instance, that makes Frost a great poet is that all his life he searched for God, for whatever it was. He never found it, and he was totally honest about it. This made him a great poet in a sense, because mostly you find people who find it in some way. Eliot finding it in Anglicanism, high Anglicanism, or Yeats finding it his own special philosophy. Frost was honest about it and said, I don't find it once then something when he saw something in a well. Kipling was not that kind of writer, and I think that's one of the reasons that he's not read much today for people who are looking for that kind of sustenance.
So I saw three hands, and if you raise your hand and catch my eye, I will eventually call on you. So one, and then two, and then three. Yeah, go ahead.
So I just had a question, actually, in regards to some of Mr. Kipling's greatest work. Throughout my childhood, I've always, written. I've read a lot. I did read, because the Jungle Book a lot. Obviously, not until just recently, when their newest movie came out a couple of years ago, did I really know that it was by him. I just wanted to know, why is that not considered one of his greatest works?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch
Why
it.
the Jungle Book?
I think his children's books are among the greatest ever written.
Yeah.
That's a different category. I would agree that the Jungle Books are splendid and deserve their fame.
My mother read the Jungle Books to me when I was 4 or 5 years old, and I still cry when I think of Mowgli having to go back and live with the people. So it may not be among his greatest works, but if it gets into your soul when you're 4 or 5 years old, it will never leave.
No,
I
agree. I agree
Yeah.
that that's a whole other category.
There were a lot of people who grew up having the Just So stories told to them as well.
Yeah.
That it really
Right.
resonates with a lot of people who come to the house.
Yeah.
Yeah, a few years ago, there was a made-for-TV film which called My Son Jack, which had him portray Kipling as a gung-ho imperialist and ready to get into the World War I and pulling every string he could to get his son in there. But then, when his son gets killed,
Right.
he completely flipped and became a pacifist. Is this...
It's a very interesting. I saw that film too. It's a very moving film. I had forgotten that the film said that afterwards he really became a pacifist, but it certainly shook him to the core. His son was like the father. The son was had very poor vision. Kipling himself could never be in the military.
Harry Potter played the part that role.
He could, because he was small. He wasn't athletic. He wasn't particularly strong. Mary Cabot could handle horses better than Kipling could when he was here.
We had poor vision.
And he had very poor
Poor vision.
But his son also did. And so the son, it looked as if there was no way he could get into the army. But you're right, and the film was right, I believe, that Kipling pulled strings and got him a commission. And he went off to fight, and I might have even been in the first battle. He disappeared, and he was never heard of again. Yeah. And Kipling was a great believer in what he would have called just war. I mean, there's no question that.
I went to college in the 60s at Georgetown, and we read a 2-volume set. Major British Writers 1, Major British Writers 2. And they were red covers. And the 3 poets that you've mentioned, Browning, Tennyson, Eliot, they were all in there, as well as a number of other poets like Keats, Shelley, and not only poetry, but other works. But I'm interested in your view a little more specifically about why Kipling was not, at least at that point in time, and I think even up to today, I don't want to say revered, but accepted in the academy. Why do university professors and colleges, why isn't he in that first rank? Is it political? Because I can remember a teacher that I had in college who said, Kipling is a dangerous man.
That's part of it. His imperialism
Yeah.
was frowned upon, very much so. But his kind of verse, which is, what shall I say? It's the balladry of the pub, the balladry of the barracks. This by some is looked down upon. But that gives me an opportunity to do something I wanted to do, because I don't think he's a great poet. He's a very prolific poet and very rhythmical and lots of fun, and there are lots of good poems. But he wrote what I consider to be one masterful poem because of the technique involved in the verse. It's called Danny Deever. Many of you, I'm sure, know it. But let me read it. If I can see it. I just had 2 cataract operations. What are the bugles blowing for, said files on parade. To turn you out, the color sergeant said. What makes you look so white, said files on parade. I'm dreading what I've got to watch, the color sergeant said. For they're hanging Danny Deever, you can hear the Dead March play. The regiment's in Hollow Square, they're hanging him today. They've taken of his buttons off and cut his stripes away, and they're hanging Danny Deever in the morning. What makes the rear rank breathe so hard, said files on parade. It's bitter cold, the color sergeant said. What makes the front rank man fall down, said files on parade. A touch of sun, the color sergeant said. They are hanging Danny Deever, they are marching of him round. They have halted Danny Deever by a coffin on the ground, and he'll swing in half a minute for a sneaking shooting hound. Oh, they're hanging Danny Deever in the morning. His out was right hand caught a mine, said files on parade. He's sleeping out and far tonight, the color sergeant said. I've drunk a beer a score of times, said files on parade. He's drinking beer, bitter beer alone, the color sergeant said. They're hanging Danny Deever, you must mark him in its place, for he's not a comrade sleeping, for he shot a comrade sleeping, you must look him in the face. 900 of his country in the regiment's disgrace, while they're hanging Danny Deever in the morning. What's that so black again the sun, said Piles on parade. Is Danny fightin' hard for life, the colour sergeant said. What's that whimpers overhead, said Files on parade. It's Danny's soul that's passin' now, the colour sergeant said. For they're done with Danny Deaver, you can hear the quick-step play. The regiment's in column and they're marching on its way. Oh, the young recruits are shaken and they want their beer today after hanging Danny Deaver in the morning. That's marvelous rhythm. The contrast between the military part of it and what's actually happening.
Yeah, yeah.
That's
Great poem.
It's from a book that was edited by T.S. Eliot, which I thought was interesting, that
Yeah.
Eliot put together a book of Kipling's verse.
That's true, and Eliot has had problems with Kipling. But in the end, he had to admit that Kipling was a poet.
So, Jerry?
Yeah, I just wanted to remark that for the past 3 years, the Landmark Trust, under the auspices and direction of Interim Director Tristram Johnson, has sponsored Just So Stories Kipling Awards, open to all 4th to 6th graders in Windham County. And last year there were 104 entries, and we picked, Tom, how many did we select from those? Do you remember?
About 22 or...
Yeah, and then they get an award for fiction, nonfiction, poetry, and then an overall award. And the overall grand prize winner gets a night at Naulakha.
A Marlboro graduate brought me a poem one day which he said was written for her. Kipling had visited her parents when she was a baby and on the spot had written a poem for her. When it came out that Thomas Pinney was editing the complete poetry, the Cambridge edition of his poems, I sent it to Thomas Pinney, and I was impressed with his reply. He said he took a poem which he had written for somebody else, and he referred me to the poem, and adapted it for her.
Yeah, true.
Hi, Chuck, you said something about they tried to come back to Brattleboro.
Yes, I think it was 1899.
It was.
Was it?
Yes,
Kelly?
yes.
1899, and apparently they intended to come back to Naulakha, at least that's the story, and probably collect some of their personal belongings, which they had left behind when they departed after the fight with Beatty. But they came over in the winter, and it was a very hard passage. And both Kipling and his daughter Josephine, who was then 6 years old, I think, and much beloved by her father, came down with pneumonia, or what we now think was pneumonia. And Kipling came within an inch of dying. It was all around the world, people were waiting to hear, has he died, is he still alive?
Daily communiques.
Daily
Yes,
communiques.
every day on the front page of the paper.
Yeah, every day in the papers. And he survived, but his daughter did not. She died. And so they did not come back here. They returned to England, and they never, I don't think Kipling never came back to the United States.
According to Molly Cabot, Mrs. Kipling did sneak into town
She
and was
went
in
to
town
Naulakha.
for less than two days. Got whatever she wanted, spoke to nobody, and went back to New York, obviously, to get something.
Yeah.
Oh, good, I missed that.
Kipling called Josephine his little American, and when she died, it broke his heart.
Yeah.
They actually couldn't tell him right away. They had to wait a while before they could tell him because
Right.
he was still so sick.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
And after that, he never wanted to come back here again. Mrs. Kipling went to Naulakha. She took all of the rugs and all of the books.
Oh, I didn't.
And left
I'm glad
everything
to know
else
that.
behind.
I didn't know that.
And then they put the house on the market. And over the years, their coachman, Matthew Howard, would receive requests for a painting or a piece of furniture or something, a memento that meant something to them. So a few more items went overseas back to them. But for the most part, they sold the house fully furnished.
And what indicates the bond between father and daughter, something that I read, the Just So stories, where did that come from?
So at night after the evening meal, he would read story, or he would make up stories for his children in the loggia at Naulakha, which is a room in the center of the house, which he called the joy of the house. It was his favorite room of all of the rooms. And the children became very familiar with these stories, to the point where Josephine would say to him, "Oh, Daddy, tell it just so." And so that's why he called them the Just So stories.
Interesting.
Yeah.
His house was built so that he could see Monadnock from the loggia, and that's why he cited it the way he did.
He was very fond of a poem that I believe Emerson wrote
He
about
was,
Naulakha,
exactly.
and when he realized that he could see it
Yeah.
from this piece of property, it felt right
Yeah.
for him, that Naulakha was like a thumb pointing heavenward, I think was what he said. So he built his house to look like a ship. So it's 90 feet long and just 20 feet wide, and he imagined he would ride his ship house over the mountains of Vermont, having many wonderful journeys and writing about them, which is exactly what he did.
Did you want to?
I was very taken with that quote, Chuck, that you had brought forth about Kipling had two places that he most wanted to live. One was Bombay and the other one was Brattleboro, and he could live in neither. And I was just wondering if you could sort of comment upon what were the attributes of those two places, at first glance so completely different,
Right.
that would elicit that kind of comment from him. What were the attributes that they might have shared?
It was Mary Cabot, whom Tom has been talking about, to whom Kipling made that remark. And I don't know.
I think he was very happy in both of those places.
Yeah, but the question is why,
Yeah.
He really was, in some respects, very happy in Dummerston, Brattleboro. He actually got along well with some of the local people. A doctor, James Conlon, who delivered Josephine and also tended Kipling when he almost died, was a very close personal friend, a very dear friend. And Mary Cabot was a good friend, and he got along well with Charles Day, the congregational minister. And he liked to talk to the baggage master at the train station because he'd pick up a lot of local gossip that way. And he liked the countryside. In some of his early letters, his description of the Vermont scene, winter, fall, spring, summer, remarkably detailed and perceptive, really lovely passages. If you read them carefully, if you don't just run over them as more fluff, if you read them carefully, they're very precise and detailed. So he responded to a lot of things here, but he had a lot of complaints also. He talked about the wildlife, much of which had disappeared. The first 100 years of Vermont settlement, we wiped out a lot of species. And so it was rather thin in Kipling's time, but he did talk about certain animals. And he said, when there is an animal, he said, one thing Vermonters like to do, they like to kill it. So that, and as for Bombay, I can't speak as closely, but I suppose it was the charm and variety and richness of Indian life, which would have been...
The energy.
Pardon?
The energy of the city.
And the energy of the city.
I have 3 biographies of Kipling. The oldest I consider to be the best, Carrington, 1955. But in his chapter, which says A Home in Vermont, we have this paragraph quoting Kipling. His first night in Brattleboro.
Oh, beautiful.
Just arrived in the train.
Right.
30 below freezing. It was inconceivable till one stepped into it at midnight, and the first shock of that clear, still air took away the breath as at a plunge into seawater. A walrus sitting on a woolpack was our host in his sleigh, that was Beatty. And he wrapped us in hairy goatskin coats, caps that came down over the ears, buffalo robes and blankets, and yet more buffalo robes, till we, too, looked like walruses and moved almost as gracefully. But for the jingle of sleigh bells, the ride might have taken place in a dream, for there was no sound of hoofs upon the snow. The runners sighed a little now and again as they glided over an inequality, and all the sheeted hills round about were as dumb as death. Only the Connecticut River kept up in heart and a lane of black water through the packed ice. We could hear the stream worrying round the heels of its small bergs. Elsewhere, there was nothing but snow under the moon. Snow drifted to the level of the stone fences or curling over their tops in a lip of frosted silver. Snow hanged high on either side of the road, or lying heavy on the pines and hemlocks in the woods, where the air seemed by comparison as warm as a conservatory. Like Catholics who were converted to Catholicism, in some ways he was more American than American in his taking in of the scenery.
He must have eventually adapted since he invented winter golf with Arthur Conan Doyle.
Yeah.
So
He embraced it, for sure.
I saw 3 hands, 1, 2, 3, so we'll get to you.
Did he actually publish any stories or poems when he was living here about Vermont?
Yeah, the horses.
Yeah, the delegates.
The 2 horses talking.
Yeah, you're talking about Her Majesty's servants?
No,
the 2, what are they, what's the name of it? The story about 2 horses talking about town meeting or something like that. There were stories like that, yes.
Where did he publish them? I mean, were they just all collected?
In collected books of short stories. Yeah.
Yeah. My question was about golf, which was just is there any more insight into the lore around golf and Conan Doyle and the start of golf in the U.S. that happened here?
Well, Conan Doyle brought the golf clubs, and after that they played on the side hill. And when I first came to Brattleboro in the late 50s and went to Naulakha, there was a bowl near where Carey used to stand guard over his study so nobody would get in. And it had 3 or 4 golf balls. They were larger than our modern golf ball. I noticed that right away. And in the literature we read, they first, because to find them in the snow, they put red ink on them.
Yeah, right.
But that washed off, and so afterwards they painted them red, and you could still see the paint on these golf balls. But I'm told they're nowhere to be seen. I've always wondered what happened to those golf balls.
Yeah. Speaking, golf reminds me of the country club, and one of his remarks, he said that they couldn't form a country club in Brattleboro because there was so much drinking that nobody could be trusted with the books. It was impossible to form an organization because everyone was drinking too much.
Yeah, just want a comment about the house. My understanding was the architecture, which really resembles a bungalow in the hill stations of India, and that the fact that the mountains were here made him believe, or gave him memories, happy memories of living in India. And someone else had said that the architect was built like a ship.
Have you heard, Kelly, about that it would resemble a bungalow? That also?
Yes, it has a lot of Indian likenesses to it. There's a carved teak cornice in one of the windows that was a gift to them that has a real Indian feel to it. Some of their furniture has a real Indian feel to it as well. Yep.
And then the name itself it's Hindi for 9 lakhs, which is an amount of money.
Yep, loosely translated, jewel beyond price.
Yeah.
Much more eloquent.
Yes. He was very, very, very proud of that house. The only house he ever designed and built for himself. That being said, his house in England, Bateman's, is, I've heard, the most visited historic site in England.
If I may speak about Bateman's, I've visited a lot of historic houses in my life, including Naulakha and Teddy Roosevelt's house and others. I think the one I was most enchanted by is Bateman's. If you're ever in Sussex, go. I expected a grand mansion because he was a great man by then and very wealthy. It's a very homey house. It's very comfortable. Small rooms, beautiful gardens. Worth a visit.
The executive director for Bateman's came and stayed at Naulakha a few years ago, and he was amazed at how bright and sunny it was, because Bateman's was very dark. and had small windows. And the thought that Kipling designed this house, which was so open and full of light, was very interesting to him.
I was just curious, I don't know if the short novella he wrote is called They or Them right now, which, which features at the very end this ability to see dead children's ghosts or to hear them, one or the other, and at the end it's revealed. And Arthur Conan Doyle had a big belief in spiritualism. I was curious, was there any other evidence of Kipling having any thoughts on spiritualism, which was so prevalent at that time?
I don't think so.
I don't think so.
There's one, is that a short story you're referring to?
It's a novella.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I remember the story, and it might lead you to wonder about that, I think, but otherwise I don't know.
His sister, Trix, they say, was very into spiritualism.
One great thing about Kipling we haven't mentioned up till now, he was fascinated with how anything worked.
Yeah.
A ship, an engine.
Right.
That's one reason he used to go down and talk to the station master or the baggage master down in Brattleboro. He wanted to know how everything worked and was particularly interested in machinery and things like this. Wrote a lot of stories about dirigibles and airplanes and ships and things of that sort.
As I recall, in India, Kipling started out his career as a journalist. I can't remember the newspaper or whether it was in Lahore or another city, town over there. What prompted him to shift into these other forms of writing, poetry, short stories? In other words, here was this fellow over there. When did he start writing the things that he's famous for? And why? What prompted him?
I think Tom may know, but I think some of them were written in India for the newspapers.
A lot of them were.
Yeah, he was a journalist and he had to cover this, that, and the other, but he also wrote stories in the newspapers and he wrote other stories not for the newspapers while he was there.
He was overflowing with material all the time.
Yeah.
Well, they say when he couldn't fill the paper with stories, he would add in his own observations or poems or short stories, and people started becoming familiar with his writing. And he said that suddenly people would come up to him on the street and say, wow, that was a great piece you wrote. And he started getting all this recognition. And
anybody who can ad-lib 72 lines of poetry to the point people have to shut him up is obviously creative. It just broke through.
Listen.
Could you talk about his relationship with, you mentioned Walcott Balestier? The brother, brother of his wife.
Yeah.
He had such an intense relationship.
The closest friend he ever had is like a brother.
Yeah. You want to?
No, go ahead.
Okay. We both know about it. Yeah. Walcott Balestier was hired by an American publisher to go to England and sign up British writers for an American publisher. And I think there were new copyright laws now, so that a British writer would be sure of having his works protected. So Walcott went to London, wanted Kipling, because Kipling was already famous. But Caroline, went with him, and I think actually the mother as well. And there, as Tom just said, Walcott and Kipling became very close friends. After a while, Kipling went off on a I think it was another round-the-world tour. I believe he was in India, when Walcott went to Germany on a trip, contracted typhus, and died. And Carrie, sent Kipling a telegram. He rushed back. Henry James said that of her that she handled all the arrangements with Walcott, getting his body back and all the things that had to be done with great efficiency and determination and lack of obvious sentimentality. So Kipling comes back, and almost immediately they decide to get married. Henry James said she was a very efficient, smart woman, but he said, I can't imagine why he wanted to marry her.
Hard and capable.
Hard and capable.
His business manager.
Right, and he predicted an unhappy marriage. And who knows what it was underneath, but in many ways it was very successful. Henry James, this always surprises me, he gave away the bride at the wedding, and he said it was a miserable or pathetic little affair because they didn't want it, dreary little affair. They didn't want it to be in the newspapers, but
Well, of course, they just buried Wolcott.
They just buried Wolcott, yeah.
So there was so much grief.
Some people have said, and with maybe tongue-in-cheek, that he might have been as much in love with Wolcott as he was with Gary.
There are rumors.
Yeah, and there's always that kind of speculation.
Could you mention, give a little bit of information about another interesting piece that's at the Marlboro College Library, the obituary Kipling wrote for George?
Oh, when he went abroad in case something happened?
Right.
Yeah, there is such a thing. I read it, and I've already forgotten the details, but I did look at it once. That is right, Mary, thank you.
What, he left behind an obituary in case?
Yeah.
My understanding was it had something to do with Kipling being upset because Putnam, as the publisher, was collecting the royalties and Kipling could not get them. Do you know about that?
Well, not specifically, I don't. But he distrusted publishers, particularly American publishers, because they kept taking his works, stealing them from the British publications and publishing them here, despite copyrights and so forth. Yeah, they didn't recognize the copyrights. He had very little use for publishers and journalists.
Even though he had been one.
Even though he had been one.
So maybe one more question or so?
Goodness, but no.
There are refreshments. Jerry, did you have a comment?
I know that Beatty kind of reconciled with Kipling. He said he forgave him at the end of his life. But did Kipling ever reconcile to Beatty?
Not that I know of. I should mention that Beatty died 4 days before I was born, and I always thought that God intended me as a replacement.
It's the same year that Kipling died.
Right.
And of course, as you know, Kipling died the same day the King died, so there was only a little notice in the Times in London that this great man had died. It was overlooked for quite a while.
Were there a lot of newspaper accounts at the time here in Brattleboro was such a hotbed of journalism in those years. Is there a lot of accounts of Kipling in the local papers?
Yes, in Howard Rice's editing of Molly Cabot's memoir, he added every reference in the local paper, the Phoenix, that he could find, and they're added to the Molly Cabot memoir. Sometimes just 2 lines or a sentence or 2.
British author sues Yankee brother-in-law. They say it was the headline all over the world.
Very funny how they still call us Yankees.
Mm-hmm.
So you've been a fine audience. Thank you.
Yeah, so before everybody goes, there are refreshments in the back, and if you're interested in coming to more of these roundtable discussions over the next few years, you can put your name down on the list, and you will receive an email. And thank you, Kelly and Chuck and Tom. This was really lovely.